Now let's look at scopes. And JavaScript is what's known as a lexically scoped language. So lexical basically means what's written. And a lexically scoped language means that a function is going to be inside of a scope in the text. And so you can look at the code and this function will be inside of a scope, and the function can access any variables that are inside of that scope. You can tell that just by looking at the text. This is different from a dynamically scoped language where um, the function can access variables that are defined in whatever function is calling the function. So for example, if I defined a variable inside of div2 and I had div2 call +2, +2 is not inside of div2. So if there's a variable that's defined inside of div2, +2 cannot access that because +2 is not inside of div2. So that's what lexically scoped means. But if JavaScript was a dynamically scoped language and div2 called +2, in a dynamically scoped language, +2 could access variables that were defined inside of div2. There are some dynamically scoped languages, but most C-family languages like JavaScript are lexically scoped instead. So let's see how that works. I'm going to start by creating a global variable. And let's set that equal to 1. And then I'm going to define a function called a global function. And it's going to take a parameter. And inside of a global function, I'm going to console.log value of a global variable colon space and then a global variable and then console.log value of a parameter plus a parameter. And then out here, I'm going to call a global function, and I'll pass in the value of 2 as an argument. And then I'll console.log both of these things again. So what do I expect to happen? So a global variable is in a global scope, and this function is defined inside of that global scope. So that means that this will return the value 1. Even though this line of code is inside of the function is lexically inside of the global scope, so I can access the value of this global variable. Now, a parameter, that's going to be local to this function here. But this line of code is inside of the function, and so that means that I can access the parameter that's defined inside of that function. Let's go ahead and add one more for a local variable. And let's set that to 3. And then let's output that value. And once again, this variable is defined inside of the same scope as this line of code. So this line of code can access this variable. Now, outside of the function, I can call a global function, which is defined in the global scope. I pass in the value 2, and so this line outputs 1, this line outputs 2, and this line outputs 3. Then outside of the function, I access a global variable, which is defined in the same scope as this line of code, so I get the value 1 again. But now when I try to access the value of a parameter is defined only inside of this function. It doesn't exist in the global scope where this line of code is executing, and so I'm going to get undefined here. And then same thing with a local variable. So let's just add 2 more lines to make this completely clear. Console.log inside of a global function, and here console.log in global scope. So let's go ahead and load the code and see what we get in the console. Now I actually get an error that a parameter is not defined, because even in JavaScript, if you try to retrieve the value of an undefined parameter or an undefined variable, you get an error. So let's go ahead and comment that out, and we'll still get an error on this line as well. And we do, so now a local variable is not defined. So let's comment that out. And now the code works correctly. So you see inside of the global function, I can access the global variable, a parameter, and a local variable. Outside of the function, I can only access the value of the global variable. Now, I can also define inside of a global function a local function. And this can have a parameter as well. And then I'm going to copy all of this code, tab it over. So this is inside of a local function. Let's define another local variable, and we'll make that one be 5. And here I'm going to call a local function and pass in the value 4. So let's go ahead and also display another parameter, and another local variable. So this function is defined inside of this scope, and this scope is inside of the global scope. So this line of code can access this, and it can access this, and it can access that. Here, there is no variable or parameter called another parameter inside of the scope that this line of code lives in. Right? So it's not defined here, it's not defined here. It's only defined inside of this function. So it's outside of the scope that this line is executing in. Same thing with that. It's outside of the scope that this line of code is executed in. So these two lines will probably cause an error. Let's go ahead and run the code and see what we get. So I have an error that another parameter is not defined. It's on this line of code right here. So let's comment that out. And then run it again. And now I have an error about another variable, another local variable. So let's comment that out as well. and then reload, and I don't get any errors. So inside of the local function, I can access the local parameter, the local variable. I can also access the global variable, the parameter that's in the outer function, and the local variable that's in the outer function. So inside of here, I can access all of these things. But inside of here, I can only access the global variable, the parameter, and the local variable. Now, same thing if I define another local function. And we'll copy all of this stuff here. So let's make this guy be 7. And let's call that guy with 6. And then that's inside of another local function. Now, another parameter lives here, and this is outside of this scope. And so this is going to cause an error. Same thing here, this is going to cause an error. I can access actually this one will work fine, but it will access this local variable. Let's go ahead and make this be a second parameter. This will work fine because it's inside of the local scope, so it can access that. This will cause an error, as I said before. This will access this, not that. And then these all are outside of the scope as well. So let's reload. We should get one error. So it's inside of another local function trying to access the value of another parameter. And then everything else works fine. So inside of a second local function, actually, let me check another local function. So inside of another local function, I get 7 for the value of another local variable. So it's accessing this one, not this one, which is defined outside of the scope of this line of code. So it's worth spending some time to make sure you understand why all of these values are getting printed the way they're getting printed. It's a pretty simple concept once you get used to it though, but it does take some getting used to.